Assalamualaikum. I'm delighted to welcome Mr. Zia Mohyeddin, a legend in his lifetime and a man of many parts. Hello? Can you hear me? Mr. Zia Mohyeddin, a legend in his lifetime, is a man of many parts. His long career spans acting, directing, writing, broadcasting, and a wide range of aesthetic disciplines. Starting as a broadcaster on Radio Pakistan, Mr. Zia Mohyeddin moved later to Radio Australia and then to England, where he studied at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts, RADA. In Lahore, his Evening with Zia Mohyeddin has become an annual fixture, and he has been delighting audiences. With a fresh repertoire of Urdu prose and poetry for the last 30 years. Zia Mohyeddin has made many memorable stage appearances in London and New York, both in classical and contemporary works. He is the first Asian to have his name up in lights, both in the West End and in Broadway. He has worked with such celebrities as Sir Laurence Olivier, Orson Welles, Peter Ustinov, Dame Judi Dench, to name but a few. About his Shakespearean performances in England, the dramatic critic of The Guardian wrote that English actors should learn from Mr. Zia Mohyeddin how to speak Shakespeare's verse. Zia Mohyeddin Saab, who is currently the head of the National Academy of Performing Arts, is also the author of 3 books. A Carrot is a Carrot, a collection of memories and reflections, and Theatrics, about different aspects of theatrical art. His new book, The God of My Idolatry, was published recently. This afternoon, he is going to give us a memorable presentation called Why is Shakespeare Shakespeare? Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome a national icon and legend, Mr. Zia Mohyeddin.
Ask for the name of a writer of universally recognized genius, and the answer invariably would be Shakespeare. His works have been hailed as the summit of perfection in the whole civilized world. Our own great poet Iqbal, in his poem titled Shakespeare, writes, "Tujhko jab दीदाए दीदार तलब ने ढूंढा ताबे खुर्शीद में खुर्शीद को पिन्हा देखा हिफ्ज़ असरार का फितरत को है ऐसा सौदा राज़दां फिर न करेगा कोई पैदा ऐसा." Roughly translated, it means when the searching eye looked at you, it saw a sun hidden in its own brilliance. Nature would never again create another like you. But why is Shakespeare Shakespeare? Or rather, why is Shakespeare uniquely Shakespeare? One reason is that though his plays were written over 400 years ago, they still resonate with remarkable insight into what it means to be human. Pick any of his plays, the earliest grisly tragedy, Titus Andronicus, or The Winter's Tale, written much later, He is always in sympathy with human nature. You want to gain some understanding of jealousy? Read Othello. You want an advice on the art of seduction? Read Richard III. You want to find out something about fear, anguish, pangs of conscience? Read Hamlet. You want to know about the fate of kings? Listen to Richard II. For God's sake, let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings. How some were deposed, some slain in war, some haunted by the ghosts they have deposed, some poisoned by their wives, all killed, all murdered. For within the hollow crown that rounds the temples of a mortal king keeps death his court. Shakespeare crystallized thought into memorable sayings. There's no other writer who condenses ideas and feelings into unforgettable phrases, phrases that we use every day without ever thinking that it was he who coined the phrase first. What's done is done. 'Tis neither here nor there. This is the long and the short of it. For goodness sake. What the dickens is his name? Too much of a good thing. We have seen better days. Budge an inch, tower of strength, filled with the milk of human kindness, and on and on and on. Shakespeare's dramatic pattern lies not in his plot, but in the succession of episodes that mark the development of a story. His plots are vehicles less for suspense, but more for the revelation of characters. It's in the dramatic pattern is in his poetry. It's in his constantly shifting narrative, constantly shifting subject matter, in irony and in wordplay. I'll give you one illustration of his wordplay. I once played Lucio, a fantastic, that is how he's described in the cast list of the play, called Measure for Measure. Now, in this play, a young man, Claudio, has been sentenced to death by the acting governor for having made his fiancée pregnant. Lucio is his friend, so he begs Lucio to do him a favor, to meet his sister, who is about to take holy orders, and persuade her to meet the acting governor and plead for mercy. He then goes on to speak 2.5 lines, which Richard Rhys, who was playing Claudio, wasn't worried about in the least, but I was. For in her youth there is a prone and speechless dialect such as move men. These lines baffled me. So I went up to the director, Graham Murray, lovable director, who knew his Shakespeare thoroughly well, and asked him what these lines meant. And he explained very patiently that the word prone means inactive, lying flat, in retirement, or with a lover. But in this instance, it also means active, whether as moving men by her subtlety or her purity. So what Claudio is implying is that when his sister goes to meet the acting governor, she would inflame him with an image of her prone on bed, or move him with her shyness. Speechless will not give away whether she is shy or sly, and dialect is, of course, manner of speech. For in her youth there is a prone and special and speechless dialect, such as move men. That these 2.5 lines, would be so loaded with double meanings, I would never have grasped had I not been acting in the play. This afternoon, I have picked a few passages from some of his plays to illustrate briefly why Shakespeare, who was dubbed as an upstart crow by the literary establishment of his time, outshone all other dramatists of his age and many ages to follow, simply because he had a wonderful manner of unfolding jealousy, suffering, melancholy, oppression, venom, passion, human failings, and human greatness. As You Like It is an elegantly finished and finely constructed comedy. Sorry. The Duke, the king that is, has been deprived of his throne by a usurper. So he and his retinue have taken refuge in the idyllic forest of Arden, where several romances blossom. Now, if you've read this play or seen this delightful pastoral comedy, you would recall that towards the end, all misunderstandings are removed, all lovers are united, and multiple marriages take place. And while these festivities are going on, news comes that the throne has been restored to the banished duke because the usurper has admitted his guilt. Everyone's blissfully happy because their exile is over, except for the melancholy character Jaques, who would rather go back to a cave in the forest than to return to the glittering life in London. It is the same Jaques who gives the oration of the famous seven ages of man. Earlier, when the Duke tells him that there must be a lot of people living in conditions far worse than they are, he morosely observes, all the world is a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances. And one man in his life plays many parts. At first, the infant mewling and puking in the nurse's arms, and then the whining schoolboy with his satchel and shining morning face creeping like snail unwillingly to school. And then the lover, sighing like furnace, with a woeful ballad tied to his mistress' eyebrow. And then the soldier, full of strange oaths and bearded like the pard, jealous in honor, sudden and quick in quarrel, seeking the bubbled reputation even in the cannon's mouth. And then the justice, in fair round belly, with good capon lined, with severe eyes and beard of a formal cut, full of wise saws and modern instances. And so he plays his part. The sixth age shifts into the lean and slippered pantaloons, spectacles on nose, pouch on side. His youthful hose, well saved. A world too wide for his shrunk shack. And his big, manly voice, turning again toward childish treble, pipes and whistles in his sound. The last scene of all that ends this strange, eventful history is second childishness and mere oblivion. Sans eyes, sans teeth, sans taste, sans everything. I can never stop being amused whenever I read this speech. Because, as you like, it was a part of our text when I was an undergraduate. And the worthy professor who taught us Shakespeare, a kindly soul, but his manner of teaching Shakespeare was grotesque, to say the least. He would read a line and then translate it into what he called simple English. And then the next line. The last scene of all, that is to say, when it is the last scene of your life, that ends this strange, eventful history, that is to say, when the history book of your life comes to a close. Is second childishness and mere oblivion? It is, you become a child again, and you have become like a child who can neither see nor remember anyone. Science eyes, science teeth, science taste, science everything. So we naturally assume that science was everything. And when we left the classroom, we would go past the science laboratory and find the chemistry students busy with their test tubes, and we would shout, "Hey, science everything!" Juvenile humor can be very juvenile. Julius Caesar is another neatly constructed tragedy which reveals personal ambition, political intrigues, and misguided idealism. The three men among whom Shakespeare divides his dramatic realm are Brutus, the idealist, Octavius Caesar, the egoist, and Mark Antony, the opportunist. Come to think of it, these three have held the world in dispute ever since. Mark Antony is a dark horse. He remains in the shadow until Caesar has been murdered, and then tactfully and dutifully approaches Brutus and asks him if he would allow Antony to address the mob which is gathered around Caesar's dead body. His aim becomes quite clear. He wants the unruly citizens to create chaos and violence. His speech is a masterly exercise in political oratory. Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. The evil that men do lives after them. The good is oft interred after their bones. The noble Brutus has told you that Caesar was ambitious. If it were so, it was a grievous fault, and grievously hath Caesar answered it. Here, under leave of Brutus and the rest, for Brutus is an honorable man, so are they all honorable men, come I to speak in Caesar's funeral. He was my friend, faithful and just to me. But Brutus says he was ambitious, and Brutus is an honorable man. He hath brought many captives home to Rome, whose ransoms did the general coffers fill. Did this in Caesar seem ambitious? When that the poor have cried, Caesar hath wept. Ambition should be made of sterner stuff. Yet Brutus says he was ambitious, and Brutus is an honorable man. You all did see that on the Lupercal I thrice presented him with a kingly crown, which he did thrice refuse. Was this ambition? Yet Brutus says he was ambitious, and Brutus is an honorable man. I come here not to disprove what Brutus has spoke, but come I here to speak of what I know. You all loved him once, not without cause. What cause holds you then to mourn for him? O judgment, thou art fled to brutish beasts, and men have lost their reason. Bear with me. My heart's in the coffin there with Caesar, and I must pause till it come back to me. But yesterday the word of Caesar might have stood against the world. Now lies he there, and none so poor to give him reverence. O masters, if I were disposed to stir your hearts and minds to mutiny and rage, I would do Brutus wrong and Cassius wrong, who, as you know, are honorable men. I will not do them wrong. I rather choose to wrong yourselves, to wrong the dead, than I'll wrong such honorable men. But here's a parchment with the seal of Caesar. I found it in his closet. 'Tis his will. Let but the commoners read this testament, which, pardon me, I do not mean to read, and they will go and kiss dear Caesar's wounds, and dip their napkins in his blood, yea, beg a hair of him for memory, and dying mention it within their wills, bequeathing it as a rich legacy unto their issues. The crowd is now clamoring for the will to be read out. The will, the will. Read us the will, the will. You will compel me then to read the will? Then make a ring round the corpse of Caesar. And dramatically he steps down from the pulpit to tell them that Caesar, who has been so savagely murdered by Brutus and his gang, has in his will left each of them money and allowed them free access to his estates. The crowd is now getting more and more incensed, and Antony, smooth as silk, good friends, sweet friends, let me not stir you to such a flood of mutiny. They that have done the deed are honorable men. A triumphant mockery of the word honorable. The concluding part of Antony's speech is a brilliant stroke of political chicanery. With a Machiavellian twist now, he tells them, I am no orator, as Brutus is, but as you all know me, a plain, blunt man who loved his friend, and that they know full well who gave me public leave to speak of him. For I have neither wit, nor words, nor worth, nor utterance, nor action, nor the power to stir men's blood. I speak right on. I tell you that which you yourselves do know. Show you sweet Caesar's wounds, poor, poor dumb mouths, and bid them speak for me. But were I Brutus, and Brutus Antony, there were an Antony who would ruffle up your spirits and put a tongue in every wound of Caesar, that they should move the stones of Rome to rise and mutiny. We'll mutiny, says the crowd. We'll burn Brutus' house. And off they go, leaving the forum. The crowd, the mob, leaves the forum. But the first victim of Antony's eloquence is Cinna. Not Cinna, the conspirator, but Cinna, the poet who keeps protesting, I am Cinna, the poet. I am Cinna, the poet. Then kill him for his bad verses, shouts someone from the crowd. And they tear him from limb to limb. This is the irony that I spoke of. Shakespeare here points out that a revolution can take a bizarre turn. 30 years after Shakespeare's death, in 1642, King Charles I was dethroned and beheaded. After centuries, royalty in England came to an end. Cromwell the Puritan now took over the reins of the realm. Now, one of the first things Cromwell did was to close down theatres in London. And they remained closed for the next 18 years. It was only with the return of King Charles II from France that the theatres were reopened and never closed down again, not all of them. But now, in the Restoration period, plays of lesser playwrights were staged twice as often as those of Shakespeare. Shakespeare was now in decline. This was because the opinion makers who traveled with King Charles II to London were heavily influenced by the aesthetic ideology of the French intellectuals, who believed that a tragedy should be written strictly in accordance with the rules codified by Aristotle. So they thought that Shakespeare was either ignorant, because he had never attended a university, or had wantonly disregarded the Greek method. And the Greek method demanded that a tragedy should be written strictly in verse, because it is an elevated form of writing, that it should exclude all comedy and comedic moments, that it should have a cast of no more than 7 to 8 players, and it should adhere strictly to the 3 unities, which is that a play should have a single plot, a single location, and the time scale of the dramatic action not to exceed 24 hours. Shakespeare completely disregarded the classical and the neoclassical precepts. So he was judged to be artless. Now, I think that Shakespeare is uniquely Shakespeare because of his artlessness. But for his artlessness, he would not have written A Merchant of Venice, a Romeo and Juliet, a Julius Caesar, an Antony and Cleopatra, a Macbeth, a King Lear, or a Hamlet. Students who study Shakespeare as part of their text often tell me that they find his blank verse to be a terrible constraint. This is largely because they tend to read each line separately. Shakespeare says lots of things all at once. He can be obscure, he can be terrifying, he can be dramatic all at the same time. Once you learn to read a sentence without a pause beyond the end of a line, enjambment that is, you get a better insight into what he is trying to say. And once you realize that the words are not frightening, on the contrary, they are your delight, then the text lifts you into a state of excitement. Shakespeare wrote mostly in what we call iambic pentameter, a verse of 5 feet which can be scanned very easily. It is, high hence, be gone away. Titam, 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 titam. But soft, what light from yonder window breaks. But you cannot, of course, come on the stage acting Romeo and say, but soft, what light from yonder window breaks. You'd be booed. You'd be laughed at. So while you have to be aware of the meter, you have to try and convey the sense of what the lines mean. This is something which poetry readers on our part ought to pay attention to, because they tend to read the meter and not the words. They might as well be saying, Dee-da-did-dum, dee-da-dim-dum, dee-da-dim-dum, dee-da-da. Romeo and Juliet is a lyric tragedy. It's a love story. And like all love stories, the fate of the lovers is doomed. We know it. We know it before we sit down to watch the play, and yet when we watch the play, we surrender to the passion, to the beauty of its structure, and of course to its superb love poetry. My bounty is as boundless as the sea. My love is deep. The more I give, the more I have, says Juliet. And Romeo? I am no pilot, but wert thou as far as that vast shore washed with the farthest sea, I would adventure for such merchandise. How precious the word merchandise become in this context. Romeo falls in love with Juliet the moment he sets his eyes on her. They meet at a masked ball arranged by Juliet's father in his palatial home. They dance with each other. They exchange cryptic, flirtatious couplets. They part when the ball is over. But Romeo is now under a spell. Late that night, he enters Juliet's house, climbs the high orchard wall, and stands beneath her balcony. He jests at scars that never felt a wound. But soft, what light from yonder window breaks? It is the east, and Juliet is the sun. Arise, fair sun, and kill the envious moon, who's already sick and pale with grief, that thou, her maid, art far more fair than she. Be not her maid, since she is envious. Her vestal livery is but sick and green, and none but fools do wear it. Cast it off. It is my lady. Oh, it is my love. Oh, that she knew she were. She speaks, yet she says nothing. What of that? Her eye discourses. I will answer it. I am too bold. 'Tis not to me she speaks. Two of the fairest stars in all the heaven, having some business to do, entreat her eyes to twinkle in their spheres till they return. What if her eyes were there, they in her head? The brightness of her cheek would shame those stars, as daylight doth a lamp. Her eye in heaven would through the airy region stream so bright that birds would sing and think it were not night. See how she leans her cheek upon her hand. Oh, that I were a glove upon that hand, that I might touch that cheek. She speaks. Oh, speak again, bright angel, for thou art as glorious to this night being o'er my head as is a winged messenger of heaven unto the white upturned eyes of mortals that fall back to gaze on him as he bestrides the lazy pacing clouds and sails upon the bosom of the air. It is at this stage that he hears Juliet say, "O Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? Deny thy father and refuse thy name. Or if thou wilt, be but sworn my love, and I'll no longer be a Capulet. Shall I hear more, or shall I speak at this? 'Tis but thy name that is mine enemy. What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet." Within hours of their secret marriage, Romeo is banished from Verona because he has killed Tybalt, Juliet's cousin, in a fight. That night, he has to leave Juliet before the rise of dawn, but Juliet doesn't want him to go. Wilt thou be gone? 'Tis not yet near day. It was the nightingale and not the lark. It was the lark, the herald of the morn, no nightingale. Look, love, what envious streaks do lace the severing clouds in yonder east. Night's candles are burnt out, and jocund day stands tiptoe on the misty mountain tops. I must be gone and live, or stay and die. Yon light's not daylight, I note I. 'Tis but a meteor that the sun exhales, therefore thou needst not be gone. And Romeo? Let me be ta'en, let me be put to death. I'll say, yon grey is not the morning's eye, 'tis but the pale reflex of Cynthia's brow. Nor that was not the lark, whose notes do beat the vaulty heaven so high above our heads. I have more care to stay than will to go. Come, death, and welcome. Juliet wills it so. It is. Hie hence, be gone, away. Divine poetry. Anti-Semitism was rampant in the Elizabethan era. So Shakespeare, in writing about the feelings of a man who belonged to a ghettoized community, Shylock that is, had to be very careful and not make him too sympathetic, or else he might have been branded as a Jew lover. And that could have meant him being thrown into the Tower of London. The original title of the play that we know as The Merchant of Venice was The Comic History of the Merchant of Venice, otherwise known as The Jew of Venice. Shylock enters the play a fully grown character, unlike many other Shakespearean characters who grow within the play. And the first scene in which he appears is a brilliant exposition of a lowly moneylender scoffing the high-born Antonio, who has publicly declared his hatred for Shylock. Antonio is now in need of money. So he and his friend Bassanio, approach Shylock, and Bassanio asks him if he would lend them 3,000 ducats. Shylock toys with him. 3,000 ducats? Well, 3,000 ducats for 3 months? Well, 3,000 ducats for 3 months and Antonio bound? Antonio is a good man. It is at this point that Antonio loses his patience and imperiously asks him whether he is going to lend them the money or not. Shylock can no longer contain his emotion. Signor Antonio, many a time and oft in the Rialto, you have rated me about my monies and my usances. Still have I borne it with a patient shrug, for sufferance is the batch of all our tribe. You call me misbeliever, cutthroat, dog, and spit upon my Jewish gabardine, and all for use of that which is mine own. Well then, it now appears you need my help. Go to then. You come to me and say, Shylock, we would have monies. You say so. You that did void your room upon my beard and foot me as you spurn a stranger cur over your threshold. money is your suit. What should I say to you? Should I not say, hath a dog money? Is it possible a cur can lend 3,000 ducats? Or shall I bend low, and in a bondman's key, with bated breath and whispering humbleness, say this: fair sir, you spit on me Wednesday last, another time called me dog, and you spat on me. And for all these courtesies, I'd lend you thus much monies? Nevertheless, he does. He does lend him the money on the condition that if he, Antonio, cannot pay it back within 3 months, Shylock would not charge any interest, but take a pound of Antonio's flesh. Antonio agrees. Time passes. 3 months are over. Shylock is now wrapped in resentful sorrow because his daughter has fled from the house and taken all the valuables. But what galls him the most is that she has eloped with a Gentile, and seething with frustration. But he knows, and this is a thought that gives him solace, that Antonio is now no longer in a position to repay his debt because his ships have been destroyed and he is a ruined man. And so we get to the court, the trial scene in which the Duke, who is the presiding judge, keeps urging Shylock to be kind and forgiving. We all expect a gentle answer, Jew. Jew was a contemptuous descriptor. Shylock's response is, I have possessed your grace of what I purpose, and by our holy Sabbath have I sworn to have the due and forfeit of my bond. If you deny me, let the danger light upon your charter and your city's freedom. You'll ask me why I rather choose to have a weight of carrion flesh than to receive 3,000 ducats. I'll not answer it, but say, 'tis my humor. Are you answered? What if my house be troubled with a rat, and I be pleased to give 10,000 ducats to have it baned? Are you answered? Some men there are love not a gaping pig, some that are mad when they behold a cat, and others, when the bagpipe sings in the nose, cannot contain their urine. For affection, mistress of passion, sways it to the mood of what it likes or loathes. So, now for your answer. As there is no firm reason to be rendered why he cannot abide a gaping pig, why he a harmless, necessary cat, why he a woolen bagpipe, but of force must yield to such inevitable shame as to offend, himself being offended, so will I give you no reason, nor I will not, other than a lodged hate and a certain loathing I bear, Antonio, that I follow thus a losing suit against him. Are you answered? The court is now speechless. Shakespeare expresses, through Shylock, the centuries-old anguish of a persecuted community. He does not, when Shylock's final address to the court is a beautifully judged condemnation of a system that allows for inequality among its citizens. He asks for judgment, but he does not get it. He does not get his pound of flesh. He was never meant to get it. Remember the comic history of The Merchant of Venice. Shakespeare wrote him as a sleazy, mingy old Jew who tries to rise above his station and gets his comeuppance. But he did so, and he had the humanity and the sensitivity to express the feelings of a community that was considered to be the outcasts. And he did it in ways which made it possible for writers and dramatists of subsequent generations to discover the voice of the outsiders, the excluded people. The uniqueness of Shakespeare was the quickness of mind and the fertility of imagination. He would pick up a history book, a Plutarch or a Holinshed, and turn passages of it into a play, a comedy, or a tragedy. In his latest work on Shakespeare, Jonathan Bate gives an excellent example of Shakespeare's compositional method. He quotes a passage from Plutarch's Life of Marcus Antonius, in which it is Antonius, in which Plutarch describes the pomp and majesty of Cleopatra. The translation, which was available to Shakespeare, was by Sir Francis North, and I quote from that. The poop whereof was of gold, the sails of purple, and the oars of silver, which kept stroke in rowing after the sound of the music of flutes. And now, for the person of Cleopatra herself, she was laid under a pavilion of cloth of gold, apparelled and attired like the goddess Venus, commonly drawn in picture, and hard by her, on either hand of her, pretty fair boys, apparelled as painters set forth the god Cupid, with little fans in their hands, with the which they fanned wind upon her. People ran out of the city to see her coming in, so that in the end Antonius was left post alone in the marketplace, in his imperial seat, to give audience. Now Shakespeare picks up every little bit of Plutarch's description, and then with delicate and luscious strokes paints a picture. It is Enobarbus, the battle-weary lieutenant of Antony, who describes the scene. The barge she sat in, like a burnished throne, burned on the water. The poop was beaten gold, purple the sails, and so perfumed that the winds were lovesick with them. The oars were silver, which to the tune of flutes kept stroke, and made the water that they beat I have here a signboard which showed me that I have only 5, now perhaps 4 minutes left. And 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 people, thinking that the time is over, have already left. Thank you very much. And so perfumed, the winds were lovesick with them. For her own person, it beggared all description. she did lie in her pavilion, cloth of gold, or picturing that Venus where we see the fancy outwork nature. On either side her, pretty dimpled boys stood like smiling cupids, with divers coloured fans in their hands, with which and whose wind did seem to glow the delicate cheeks which they did cool, and what they undid did. Her gentle women, like the neary-eyed, so many mermaids, tended her i' the eyes and made their bends adornings. At the helm a seeming mermaid steers. The silver tackles swell with the rise and touches of those flower-soft hands that yearly frame the office. From the barge, a strange, invisible perfume hit the sense of the adjacent wharves. The city cast her people out upon her, and Antony, enthroned in the marketplace, did sit alone, whistling to the wind, which, but for vacancy, had gone to gaze on Cleopatra too, and made a gap in nature. This is heady, voluptuous poetry. Poor Antony, sitting on his throne in the marketplace, abandoned and reduced to the status of a mere spectator of Cleopatra's magnificence. That love and pain have something to do with each other is a thought that Shakespeare develops later in Antony and Cleopatra, when Cleopatra compares the stroke of death to a lover's pinch, which, as she says, hurts and is desired. अगर ये लज्जत आज़ार नहीं तो क्या है? लज्जत आज़ार, तू मश्क नाज कर खूने दो आलम मेरी गर्दन पर. The play in Antony and Cleopatra is full of dramatic poetry, but for brevity and subtlety, I've picked the 6.5 lines spoken by Cleopatra when a messenger informs her that Antony is dead. Come, see my women. The crown of the earth doth melt, my lord. Oh, withered is the garland of war. Young boys and girls are level now with men. The odds is gone, and there's nothing left remarkable beneath the visiting moon. Now, on the surface, this sounds like ecstatic nonsense, but there's enough meaning in it for us to feel that there might be a little more. And it gives us to perfection the reeling agony of Cleopatra. I feel that before another gentleman goes across, I should say, I thank you for listening to me with such patience. Thank you very much.